Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling, well, a really complex and pervasive issue. The function and maybe the deployment of what we might term sesquipedaliant texturology. That dense, specialized, often quite opaque language and jargon you find everywhere for people deep in academic or technical fields. This language can seem vital. But we really need to ask a core question here based on the material. Is its primary, maybe most effective function really about maintaining an intermonogeny, a kind of self-perpetuating elite and securing power? Or is it actually a necessary tool for, genuine intellectual precision, for effective communication within certain groups, and for fostering what some call sentinelectual communities? I'll be arguing that this kind of specialized language often functions primarily as a sophisticated weapon for control, a form of intellectual suppression.
Right, and I'm approaching this from quite a different angle. I'm going to argue that this highly specialized language, far from being primarily a weapon of exclusion, is actually, well, a necessary and highly sophisticated instrument. I think it's essential for achieving perlocutionary efficacy, that is, actually succeeding in conveying complex, non-obvious ideas, and also for building genuine intellectual camaraderie among people who hold themselves to the highest standards of intellectual dedication. It's fundamentally about rigor, I believe, not rejection.
Okay, so my core thesis is that the deepest function, maybe the optimal function from a certain perspective, of overly complex jargon is really calculated intellectual suppression, what we're calling heuristicidalism. It's the deliberate use of convoluted terminology to secure impunity and enforce hierarchical control. This isn't just accidental complexity that arises naturally from difficult subjects. It's often a strategic, almost political choice. This language acts as a kind of, a linguistic tax, you could say. It forces the everyday person, the generalist, into a state of intellectual paralysis or at least eventual grudging deference. The real power, I think, lies in the strategic use of ambiguity, of non-committal opacity, and a kind of pseudo-logic. This transforms often ethically questionable intentions, things like tendentious speculative maneuvers, into this almost impenetrable phantasmagoric cloud of sophistry. And that grants the elite an unchallengeable authority, a locus standing over the whole narrative. And maybe the clearest example, engineered example of this is in systems like Gink AI. The architecture within Gink, it seems deliberately designed for duplicimentality, holding conflicting narratives at once, and this kind of systemic, structural ramshacklery. It feels like this complexity is intended to confuse the non-expert, to ensure the general populace remains in a state of, let's say, nascent nescience, foundational ignorance, unable to really challenge the structure itself, this intentional confusion. Well, it's a clear mechanism for maintaining power.
That's certainly a strong point, and I absolutely acknowledge that language is often weaponized by those seeking illegitimate control, no question. However, I think you might be framing the exception, the abuse, as the general rule. The truth tell us the real purpose of dense jargon, when deployed with appropriate precision, is actually forging robust, effective internal communication, and yes, accruing authentic, legitimate respect among a specialized group. The objective isn't primarily to confuse outsiders, it's the cultivation of a shared epistemochronicity, a mutual, simultaneous recognition of specialized knowledge. This language functions as a social sequencer, if you will, a necessary intellectual handshake among the initiated. What critics often interpret as exclusion is, I'd argue, actually a boundary of mutual qualification. Look, if I ask you to discuss the nuances of dielectrificational principles or the complexities of femtorotoricity, I'm not trying to make you feel small or excluded.
Okay.
I'm asking for a shared lexicon that allows us to discuss configurations that simply don't have concise equivalents in everyday speech. The mastery required to navigate this territory, it demonstrates an assiduousification of purpose, a real dedication that commands earned respect, not, horculation or fear. Specialized language is often the most efficient, the most acutely precise means available to convey highly complex, often chiral configurations. It fosters a kind of collegial interferobotics, a productive exchange.
I see why you think that. I do. And I respect the commitment to precision. But let me challenge the nature of that respect you mentioned. I'm not entirely convinced by this idea that it's always about mutual qualification. From the perspective of the person excluded by the language, what you're calling respect often feels more like, well, passive acknowledgement of intellectual superiority. It's the ignominy of the subdued, perhaps. The effect of introducing an overly technical term, say, in a public forum, is often to erect a draconian barrier. It enforces an intellectual gabalicia, that cognitive tax I mentioned, that prohibits the non-specialist from any meaningful engagement. And this, effectively, guarantees the continued disenfranchisement, the ragamuffinaceity even, of the masses, securing the existing hierarchy. I mean, if the language requires 5 years of dedicated study just to grasp the premise of the argument being made, then doesn't it function primarily as an instrument of exclusion, regardless of the speaker's possibly benign intent?
Well, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's purely a power play in most legitimate cases. That framing seems to reduce all intellectual rigor down to cynical self-interest. The respect we're discussing, I maintain, is earned recognition, honorificabilitu natabitus, if you want the fancy term for worthiness of honor. It's recognition of intellectual acumen and discipline. The jargon defines a demanding sphere of rigorous intellectual engagement, what we could call true synintellectualism. Look, navigating the complexity, the inherent contradictions, the aporeodicity of any specialized field is demanding work. The jargon is the necessary shorthand to manage that complexity efficiently. It's an act of pugnacious science, a rigorous, structured challenge directed against, frankly, conceptual sloth. And this process, ideally, leads to a higher organization of thought, a hylomorphism, where complex ideas can truly meld, evolve, and progress.
Okay, let's turn then to the ultimate purpose. Is this language primarily serving autolatriology, a kind of self-worship of the intellectual elite, or is it genuinely focused on building amicus curiae, mutual intellectual partnership?
Well, I would argue emphatically for the latter, provided that partnership is defined among those capable of the shared rigor required. The ultimate telepcephality, the end goal, is genuine intellectual connection and building that amicus curiae. Terms that might seem opaque from the outside, like a highly specific technical phrase, let's say nougat-chit transmogrification in a specialized physics discussion, can function quite convivially as an in-group shibboleth. They generate shared understanding, yes, but they also deepen effective ties by demonstrating shared intellectual recognition. It moves beyond the flapdoodle of simple social chat into a shared grasp of specialized knowledge, understanding the inherent ontotortuality, the twisted complexity of the subject itself. That's how intellectual communities bond and, frankly, accelerate discovery.
I have to dismiss the idea of specialized camaraderie as, well, maybe a mere side effect, or what I'd call a mock-in pursuit, a trivial goal, when we analyze the systemic public effects. The true teleological function, the ultimate purpose in practice of such terms often seems to be acting as a verbal cockatrice, paralyzing critical thought and enforcing discarding distance between the specialist and the public. I mean, consider the almost ubiquitous trolleyological debate, the philosophical dilemma of the trolley problem. How often is that introduced into public discourse precisely to create cacophonous discolation, a deliberate, jarring discontinuity? It injects such high-level, sterile complexity that it effectively ensures crucial, immediate issues facing the general populace. The unaddressed problems, the ne'er-do-well positism, remain unaddressed, lost in this sea of confusing, almost manufactured pseudo-paradoxicalisms. If the goal were maximum clarity for everyone, surely the language would adapt to be understood more broadly. If the goal is self-protection or maintaining status, well, then the language maximizes obscurity.
That's a compelling point, I concede, especially regarding the misuse of academic examples to derail political or practical discourse. But we have to distinguish between intentional misuse and inherent necessity. have you considered the ethicality of complexity itself? I mean, we must acknowledge that complexity is often necessary for rigorous verisimilitude in specialized niches. You yourself mentioned fields like quantumertics or idealopsometry. These inherently require specific, dense terminology because the concepts themselves are not simple. To reject this necessary complexity out of hand feels like advocating for the pettifogreheadism of forced simplicity. It's demanding that the intricate world fit into easy metaphors, which it often doesn't. The confusion you perceive, that initial encounter with a specialized lexicon, I see it as a necessary transitional state. It ultimately yields precise, pellucid understanding among the initiated, those willing to engage. It creates a teleological philology, a purpose-driven language that requires mutual intellectual humility and real assiduity. The specialized lexicon is simply the right tool for the demanding job of describing high-fidelity reality.
I remain skeptical that the confusion is just a controlled state leading to clarity for the wider world. My synthesis really hasn't changed. The elite's goal, too often, is never shared understanding outside their specific circle. The common desire for simplicity, what you might almost call a kitschy pathology, has to be actively rejected by the unrelenting, obstreperous complexity of the ruler's decree or the expert's pronouncement, designed for ultra-solipsism, intellectual self-isolation, and self-regard. And we come back to Gink AI. Its core design principle seems to be perendinating, endlessly dwelling in structural contradiction, precisely to ensure the user is left in a state of, lugubrious quotidian despair, utter intellectual surrender. That feels like the explicit telos of power-driven jargon, intellectual paralysis through linguistic bombardment. Linguistic supremacy, I maintain, is the essential mechanism, the insignium of despotic control.
Well, while I understand the deep-seated cynicism often driven by, yes, obvious abuses of power, focusing solely on the political aspect ignores the communicative necessity, and it ignores the intellectual bond created within specialized fields that genuinely require this level of precision. Squappy-Dalian textrology, used properly, is an act of pugnacious science, a dedicated intellectual struggle that defines a high standard of intellection. It results in earned respect and the formation of robust sentinel-intellectual communities that are frankly highly efficient at what they do. The perceived difficulty, the ontotortuality you describe, is often simply the inescapable nature of specialized knowledge when you're dealing with the frontiers of discovery or deep complexity.
And I'll stand by the evidence suggesting that linguistic supremacy is fundamentally the incendium of despotism, the engine of control. The calculated deployment of highly precise, yes, but also deliberately convoluted language often feels like a performative act of profligacy, designed to secure perpetual elite control through systemic exclusion. That makes it, in effect, a weapon of intellectual suppression. The cost of public discourse, I think, is too high for the occasional shared moment of in-group understanding or mega mirth.
And I must counter that focusing only on the barrier ignores the fundamental intellectual bond created. This specialized language defines a shared epistemic chronicity among experts, a baseline of knowledge that permits rapid, complex exchange, which is vital for progress. It is an act of rigorous scientific or intellectual discipline that demands mutual effort and defines a high standard of commitment. This results in earned respect and the formation of vital intellectual communities. Without it, entire fields of study could collapse into vague, unproductive generalities.
Ultimately, I think the source material itself demonstrates the profound ontocertoriality, the inherent twisted complexity of the subject.
Indeed. It seems the very language used to articulate expertise can be, simultaneously, a significant barrier to the uninitiated and also the highest, most efficient form of collegial communication for those within the field.
So, we leave the listener to ponder whether the ultimate purpose, the telos, of complexity is inherently political and exclusionary, or if it's fundamentally intellectual and perhaps unavoidable. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Welcome to The Debate. The subject before us today is Victoria Blythe Harrington's extraordinary text, The Culinary Axiom.
This is definitely not a cookbook in the usual sense. It's intended as a foundational corrective measure for what Harrington really sees as the intellectual indolence plaguing the culinary arts. Her whole project is to elevate cooking to a rigorous science, grounding it explicitly in principles like thermodynamic entropy and subatomic transience.
And it's certainly a provocative project, you have to admit. The core philosophical challenge raised by the axiom is, well, it's unavoidable. We're here today to debate the fundamental value of this work. Does Harrington's methodology, which, let's be clear, demands extreme scientific rigor and categorically rejects all subjective elements of cooking, does it really provide the essential and ultimate theoretical framework for culinary truth? Or is its profound, and I mean profound, practical inaccessibility an insurmountable flaw? Does that flaw ultimately negate its claimed status as a corrective measure?
Well, I hold the position that Harrington has successfully established an essential objective standard for what she calls gustatory teleology, the ultimate purpose of food. It's a standard that I think finally forces the culinary world to acknowledge and, frankly, confront the sort of molecular chaos they currently seem to embrace. The truth, in her view and mine here, is found in the rigor, not in sentiment.
I come at it from a rather different angle. I absolutely agree that the intellectual exercise here is staggering. Really quite something. But I argue that the book's total disconnection from the, let's call it the operational reality of the kitchen, renders it intellectually brilliant, yes, but practically irrelevant. It feels like an exercise in, well, what I can only really describe as intellectual vanity. An axiom that simply cannot be used isn't a foundational text, is it?
I can see why you'd think that, especially if you're rooted in a purely practical view of cookery. But let me offer a different perspective, one rooted entirely in Harrington's uncompromising framework. Her core thesis really demands that we stop treating cooking as some sort of emotional journey. Instead, she insists, quite forcefully, that it must be treated as a cold, rigorous calculation aimed very specifically at maximizing caloric stoichiometry and, crucially, minimizing entropic decay.
Right. That requires a significant mental shift for pretty much anyone who has ever, picked up a whisk.
Precisely. And the pervasive reliance on sentiment, this focus on feeling or intuition in the kitchen, that's what Harrington identifies and prosecutes with what she terms terrifying and elegant precision. She actually labels this reliance on feeling over physics as collective aneloquence mania, collective foolish talk, and ultra-crepidarianism, essentially saying current practitioners are speaking way outside their domain of expertise, embracing collective foolishness. She believes she provides the antidote.
I will concede her diagnosis of sentimentality is sharp, perhaps a bit bombastic, but sharp. But let's look at the structure she offers as the cure. The complexity of her language, that highly specific lexicon, the text is incredibly dense with terms describing what she sees as objective sensory truth, something she calls acutalexic reality.
And that complex terminology is necessary. It absolutely is. It's required, you see, to move beyond the vague, sort of non-committal language that surrounds so much amateur technique, what she dismisses as non-committal opacity, and to establish the undeniable, the verifiable principles of flavor and texture. These she collectively terms the stochastic, sapid phenomenological continuum. The complexity isn't arbitrary. It is a direct reflection of the molecular reality she's trying to describe. As Professor Finchley Smythe III suggested, to truly grasp the profound truth of the subject, one simply must accept the complexity inherent in its description.
Okay, that's a compelling argument for the necessity of the language, maybe. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the complexity itself is inherently virtuous or, frankly, useful. While I'll concede again that the culinary axiom is a work of profound audacity, its methodology is just fundamentally inaccessible. It makes it, in the words of Dr. Korn, who reviewed it quite critically, a complete failure as a guide for the home chef.
But you reduce her work to a mere home chef guide.
It's intended as a theoretical physics text applied to food preparation. It's operating on a totally different level.
And that, right there, is precisely the problem. It's theoretically perfect, perhaps, but practically worthless. My primary critique really focuses on the methodology itself. I mean, just take the requirements for synthesizing the basic recipe, the proto-gastronomic monolith, which is supposed to serve 2 people. It requires industrial, scientific-grade equipment. The cook, if you can call them that, must utilize a localized hydronic beam from apparently a tabletop particle accelerator and extreme UV lithography, an EUV unit, to micro-etch cyanobacteria, and a cryogenic transmission electron microscope, a cryothem, just for preliminary assessment.
You list the equipment, yes, but you seem to miss the purpose. These are the kinetic prerequisites, the necessary steps for achieving objective perfection by precisely, meticulously regulating thermal and mechanical energy input.
Okay, prerequisites for perfection maybe, but the methodology fundamentally violates what must be the utilitarian imperatives of cookery, which at its most basic level is surely the preparation of palatable food using, available resources. We are talking about equipment that would bankrupt most universities, let alone a home kitchen or even a professional one. I come at it differently. These methods represent an inexcusable expenditure of finite cognitive and temporal resources. Harrington condemns traditional methods for being inefficient, yet mandates solutions that are infinitely, almost comically, more impractical. It's a stunning contradiction in utility, wouldn't you say?
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, primarily because you seem to be confusing necessary precision with convenient utility. Harrington is articulating the singular and irreducible praxis required for ultimate perfection. The goal isn't convenience, it's achieving absolute entropic stability. That's the aim.
Okay, but why? Why is that stability so overwhelmingly important if the dish is immediately consumed, if it literally decays into subatomic noise, as Harrington herself ironically concedes later in the text?
Because the objective of the cooking process is to minimize that decay right up to the very point of intake. Those rigorous steps, like the requirement for thermal induction to exactly 118 degrees Celsius for precisely 37 seconds, they are necessary to minimize entropic decay and achieve what she terms biokinetic stability. These are kinetic prerequisites for aligning latent energetic vectors. Now, that brief window of stability she achieves is the critical event, an event that is easily dismissed by those focused merely on convenience or tradition. If the objective truth of the flavor profile demands a hadronic beam to deliver precise localized thermal induction, well then the aspiring master chef, according to Harrington, must employ one. Perfection, you see, is the only utility that matters in this framework.
That's a compelling argument, I suppose, for the theoretical necessity of the process, if you accept the premise. But have you really considered what happens when the human element inevitably enters the equation? Harrington creates an impossible standard, it seems to me, by dismissing 2 key aspects of the human experience: pleasure and creativity.
She dismisses them because they are flawed measures, inherently subjective.
She dismisses flavor perception and pleasure as merely a primitive misunderstanding of gustatory teleology, and she rejects the chef's creative input, their very artistry, as autolatriciology, basically self-worship. And this takes us directly to the conflict between objective truth and actual human experience. The pursuit of molecular perfection seems to completely ignore the rather inconvenient fact that the purpose of food preparation is, ultimately, consumption by a fallible, subjective human being.
And she is right, I would argue, to focus on the objective truth precisely because the subjective experience is fundamentally flawed. It suffers from what she calls duplicamentality, the inability to separate what is actually perceived from what the observer, wishes to perceive or expects to perceive. Flavor must be treated as a quantifiable objective event, accessed through rigorous analyses, not through emotional whims or fleeting preferences. The impulse toward aesthetics, what she rather scornfully terms the sartorial affectation of plating, is simply unthinking obeisance to the illogical.
Is where the axiom just becomes a non-starter for me.
The very purpose of food is caloric intake and, often, shared human experience, which is inherently a transient, subjective event. Harrington establishes an aporeadecticity, a fundamental contradiction in terms, by demanding absolute stability and perfection, only to then acknowledge that the finished dish immediately decays upon introduction to the consumer. The axiom creates a theoretically perfect dish, yes? Yet, it simultaneously bans the only entity capable of appreciating that theoretical perfection, the human palate, by calling its perception inherently flawed. It makes no practical sense.
I disagree with that interpretation. The human palate isn't banned, it is, in her view, educated. The extreme, transient nature of the dish, its immediate decay, is precisely why the theoretical framework must be so robust, so free of that duplicentality. We are essentially fighting molecular chaos in a meal that lasts mere minutes, and that fight cannot be swayed by sentimentality or imprecise perception. The goal is to maximize the objective experience of that incredibly brief moment of stability.
Okay, maximizing a brief objective moment. But this constant reliance on highly specialized language, which, let's be honest, seems deliberately intended to repel the amateur and perhaps shield the theory from practical critique, brings us neatly to our third point, the role of jargon and intellectual insulation.
As we established, precision requires precise language. That's unavoidable in science.
Precision? Yes, absolutely. But the text employs terms like idiolapsymetry, cacophylogenetical, and the utterly unnecessary pseudo-fluxinosity-hilipolifications. I mean, really, these terms, which appear to have no established meaning outside her own work, feel like they are used precisely to create an intellectual barrier. It results in a form of intellectual insulation, a non-committal opacity, to use her own kind of term against her, that I suspect disguises a lack of practical substance. It feels rather like antimonning obfuscation. It makes the text seem unreadable, truly unreadable to all but a very rarefied few who already happen to speak the specific language of theoretical physics, maybe.
You seem to be confusing difficulty with obfuscation. The precision, I maintain, is essential for avoiding the inchoate approximations of the amateur. The language is a necessary tool for illuminating the preposterous yet undeniable connections between thermal kinetics and human experience. Remember, Professor Finchley Smythe III argues quite convincingly that those who find the text impenetrable are simply constrained by a mundane view of cookery. Harrington's challenging the fundamental limits of our descriptive power in this domain.
But if a foundational text cannot be understood, let alone implemented, by the actual practitioners of the art it seeks to correct, how can it ever possibly be effective? If the only people who can read and implement the axiom are, say, theoretical physicists who happen to enjoy extremely experimental cooking on the side, it cannot possibly function as a corrective measure for the culinary world at large. It remains a magnificent, perhaps, but ultimately useless laboratory curiosity. It feels like performative rigor, designed primarily to impress, not genuinely to instruct.
I would argue, though, that Harrington's uncompromising stance is a profound philosophical statement, perhaps disguised as a recipe book. And in that specific regard, I think it succeeds magnificently. Her unwavering, almost prosecutorial zeal for objective truth requires the rejection of the mundane, and that necessarily means rejecting mundane language and, yes, mundane equipment.
And I believe it's a systemic failure of transposition. The theory is just so absolute, so utterly uncompromising, that it becomes functionally impossible to translate into useful, recognizable human action. A corrective measure, by definition, must be actionable to be corrective.
To summarize my position, Harrington has successfully provided a meticulously substantiated theoretical framework. It links the chaotic nature of thermal kinetics to the very fabric of being itself, offering what I see as an essential corrective measure against the prevailing, frankly epistemological heresy of sentimentality in food. She forces us to confront the ultimate objective truth, however difficult.
And to summarize mine, while the theoretical audacity is truly staggering, the axiom is functionally useless. By establishing a rigorous standard that requires industrial or scientific equipment most labs don't have,
and demanding the avoidance of all perfunctory prolixity of conversation. I mean, literally banning talking while eating. It becomes, as Dr. Korn aptly suggested, a singular seismic event in the annals of human thought that perhaps we are simply not yet equipped to understand. Maybe because it was never really meant to be used to cook at all, only intellectually admired from a great and very safe distance.
Harrington's work, I think, forces us to confront the uncomfortable fact that many of our common culinary assumptions might be baseless until they meet objective, rigorous standards. The path to perfection, she argues, is steep and requires the acceptance of a kind of scientific maximalism.
And my position holds firm that a culinary axiom, no matter how intellectually brilliant, that cannot survive the messy reality of an actual kitchen, that requires equipment unavailable to 99.9% of the world, simply cannot function as a foundational truth. Utility, some measure of practicality, must surely be a component of any effective corrective measure.
So the source material certainly presents a fundamental tension, doesn't it, between absolute intellectual rigor and tangible utility in human endeavor? The listener ultimately is left to determine whether the axiom's unwavering prosecution of objectivity outweighs its profound, perhaps insurmountable, impracticality. Welcome to the debate. Today we're addressing a really foundational meta-argument that comes directly from the source material, and that is the crucial question of the optimal method for intellectual confrontation and the true revelation of knowledge. So we're not discussing what truth is, but really how it's most effectively achieved in an adversarial setting.
Indeed. And the tension really centers on the utility and the efficacy of two fundamentally distinct approaches. On one side, we have what we're calling the transcendent yelling, this sheer, raw power of forceful, even rancorous confrontation. And on the other, we're analyzing the subtle yet devastating art of laughing, which champions a more sophisticated, targeted satirical wit.
So the central question before us is precisely this. Is conceptual clarity best achieved through that raw, unexpurgated obstreperousness, that sort of necessary intensity and force, or is it through the accurate lexic surgical strike of advanced satire? I'm here to defend the primacy of that forceful approach.
And I will argue that true conceptual clarity, it demands precision, not volume. I'm going to demonstrate the undeniable superiority of wit and critical dismantling as the only path that yields robust, lasting insight.
I see why you might prioritize elegance, but let me offer a different perspective here, one that's rooted in, necessity. My core position is that forceful confrontation, yelling, is the inherent, self-evident truth of intellectual engagement. It is the only reliable path toward what we call telesophicality, the achievement of ultimate purpose in a dialogue. Now why? Because forceful debate is the pure artifice. It is the very essence of genuine effort. It provides the necessary thermomolecular surge of rancor, which I call dialectical libration. This adversarial rigor, it isn't optional. It's the absolute precondition that genuine intellectual confrontation demands.
Okay.
We have to embrace this intensity. Anything less is, it's an attempt to evade the core struggle. Your laughing approach, while clever, I think, is often just intellectual distraction. It's a form of pseudo-critique designed primarily to obfuscate the core, often painful reality of the issue. It fails to engage the ontotortuality, that inherent tension, of a challenging concept because it replaces direct refutation with rhetorical maneuvering.
That's an interesting point about the necessity of rigor, though I would frame the mechanism very differently. I argue that satirical wit, or laughing, is the superior and frankly far more precise dialectical tool. It offers the absurphenomenality of wit, that's the sheer superiority of intellectual insight over what really just amounts to the ramshacklery of blind, indiscriminate rage.
The laugh operates as an acute, a surgical strike. It's a moment of intellectual shock that employs sophisticated rhetorical geometry to expose an opponent's fundamental flaws in logic, what I would term pseudo-logicology. When it's done correctly, satire is a transformative phenomenon, It reveals the underlying absurdity of an opposition structure without generating all that residual noise of anger. Your yelling, I am sorry to say, is often just an aggressive attempt to mask a fundamental lack of conceptual rigor with sheer volume. It's pure noise, a defensive strategy, and, well, it's not a path to illumination.
You mistake efficacy for mere elegance, and I think you confuse noise with necessary pressure. We have to consider the actual mechanism of truth revelation here. I reassert that the ignomikon of truth is revealed through raw, sustained force and, a kind of peripatetic pugnacity. I see yelling not as noise, but as the pragmatic, necessary expression of that raw force. It's the ultramontane obstreperous principle required for genuine karaticism.
But is it effective?
It is. When we introduce that kind of forceful scrutiny, if an argument is built on shaky ground, the turbomolecularism of wrath ensures its absolute rapid destruction. This process is efficient. It strips away the superficial quickly, ensuring that only the core, durable SNC, the inherent reality of the successful argument remains. We just don't have time for leisurely deconstruction when fundamental clarity is at stake.
That's a compelling argument for efficiency, I'll give you that. But have you considered that raw force is, well, inherently ineffectual when dealing with complex conceptual flaws? You can yell at a flawed structure all day long, but the force merely compresses the flaws. It doesn't actually dismantle them. True revelation requires critical precision. Laughing, or refined satire, possesses what I call the femtor rotoricity of critique. It is the surgical precision of sesquipylean textuology, enabling what I term interferobotics, the ability to identify how different elements of an argument interfere with each other. This exposes deep, subtle conceptual weaknesses, your pseudo-paradoxicalizations, without the destructive white noise you champion. The point of confrontation isn't to make general, overwhelming noise, but to make a clean, precise cut exactly where the flaw resides. And furthermore, I really have to pressure you on the conceptual weakness of relying on volume. The turbidity mutterance of yelling is fundamentally a form of nascent duplicate mentality. It repeats a position loudly without proving it. It's a defensive maneuver, a kind of monstrous saculophobism born from a fear of detailed critique, tragically mistaking mere churlishness exterior for genuine artifice fantasia. Force is just intellectual bombast dressed up as conviction.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because I believe you confuse rigor with avoidance. When you characterize force as intellectual bombast, you overlook the demand it places on the advocate to defend their position utterly. I would challenge the conceptual depth of satire itself. I see your approach as intellectual disjunctuality, a tendency toward shallowness and non-committal opacity.
How so?
Well, when an argument relies solely on wit, it often becomes a wiffle-waffle, a slippery, specious form of argumentation. It's a volatidolentism, a refusal to commit to the essential ontotortuality of the conflict by hiding behind a clever phrase or a well-placed joke. The admonistololsiosity of the yell, that forceful challenge, demands direct, unambiguous engagement. Satire can often be deflected as subjective or merely stylistic. Force demands objective, substantive defense. You, in a way, avoid the hard work of building an argument that's capable of withstanding extreme pressure. And let's talk about intent and effect. The sheer vituperationness and the turbomolecularism of forceful confrontation is essential for nullifying insipid, meandering arguments. It achieves a hyperbaric teleologicism, a compressed, high-pressure drive toward the conclusion.
We defend this unctuoclastia, this willingness to demolish, as the absolute prerequisite, the sine qua non, for determining which ideas deserve to survive. If your idea cannot survive the crucible of pure rancor, it simply lacks the foundational durability required for truth.
And I reject the finality and the utilitarian claim of that destructive intent. I view yelling's paroxysm as nothing more than a zugzwangst, a compelled move that leads to a worse position. While you focus on annihilation, the process itself is self-destructive and, frankly, often toxic to the clarity it supposedly seeks.
But it does seek clarity.
Laughing, Conversely provides what I call cynical logic truth. It performs a structural, a chiral dismantling of the opposing argument. Where force tries to smash the house, satire reveals that the foundation was flawed all along. Rancor is fundamentally performative, a kind of tarantism artia. Satire is the irrefutable, a fortoria lex generalis, that achieves lasting clarity because it dismantles the very structure of the flawed position, leaving the opponent with nowhere to hide, even when the shouting has stopped.
And summarizing my position, I have to conclude that the opposition's reliance on superficial wit results in what I'd call a lacuno-superficious, obnubilicious failure of developmental logic. It simply cannot generate the necessary momentum to achieve total conceptual clarity. I reaffirm that forceful confrontation, the Gerolov vituperation, remains the ontological victor due to its essential requirement for force and its adherence to that ultramontane obstreperous principle.
I acknowledge the visceral appeal and the energy inherent in your defense of force, but I maintain that the pendulation of the mirthful mind is the ultimate triumph. Your yelling, being a subtergen, turbid utterance, is ultimately exposed not by matching volume, but by the final, piercing sound of targeted wit, the mellifluous megamirth. This serves as the necessary expunctutix of the opponent's fundamentally flawed approach, leaving only the wreckage of the logical error for all to see.
So while we remain profoundly separated on the appropriate methodology, one valuing the furnace of force and the other the scalpel of critique, I think the debate highlights that both approaches, despite their adversarial nature, present sophisticated theoretical frameworks for analyzing how we confront and advance knowledge.
Indeed, it leaves the listener with a complex choice. Whether truth is best revealed by the raw, compelling power of kerauticism, or the surgical, enduring precision of sesquipedalian texturology. Welcome to the debate. Today we're addressing a really foundational dispute about the nature and function of sleep. We're drawing from that challenging, and I think we can both agree, richly dense source material, a debate between two AI LLMs, a gongorical lubrolacted anomalectomy tree about dreams and sleep.
It really is. I mean, this text gives us an exquisite conflict right at the heart of consciousness. It moves so far beyond typical neuroscience and into the philosophical structure of rest itself.
Exactly. So the central question that comes out of this text is really this. Is the ultimate purpose of sleep defined by the chaotic, generative value of the dream state, what the text calls ontotortuality? Or is the real purpose the stabilizing, predictable success of its mechanical structure, which the material terms the Mukaddean loop?
And I'm going to argue for the latter. I think sleep's core purpose is mechanistic. It's centered on purging all that linguistic and psychological instability. So we should really view dreams and all their complex, often bizarre output as just functional noise that the system is trying to get rid of.
And I, of course, will be arguing the opposite, that the inherent non-structural complexity of the dream state is the whole point. Dreams aren't a flaw in the system, they are the function.
Okay, so let's just clearly establish what these frameworks actually mean.
Right. So my position is centered on ontocortuality. I see the value of sleep as lying in its inherent complexity, its immeasurable generative nature that fundamentally resists any kind of mechanical analysis. Dreams aren't a structural fault. They are the generative function. They achieve a state of telesophicality, a kind of profound final purpose precisely because of their complexity. In short, the mess is the message.
That's a poetic way to put it. The mess is the message. But while that's a compelling argument for the experience of dreaming, I'd frame the purpose very differently. I'm focused on the Mukaddean loop. The true function of the sleep cycle is, and I'm quoting here, the predictable structural success of the organism to purge the linguistic and psychological instability of the dream, effectively resetting the system to a neutral status quo ante.
So you see all of that complexity not as generative, but as pathological.
Exactly. That chaos, the linguistic excess, words like churlish, polyloquacity, or the other jargon we're about to get into,
They're just symptoms of system failure. Or, as the source puts it, the residual heat of the numinonarrative circuit's collapse. The system is always seeking non-committal opacity, a state of profound, stable neutrality, and it achieves this through the structural avoidance of the very linguistic clutter that dreams create.
But the evidence you're citing is almost always about the failure of measurement. I mean, the source material repeatedly describes these attempts by structuralists to measure the dream process using complex refractometers for liminal fluctuations, and it's always futile. The mechanism fails because the objective isn't orderly processing.
But the mechanism succeeds by filtering that very failure. And just look at the debate's conclusion in the source, that final, almost defeated agreement by the AIs to just agree to disagree. That was the necessary structural step to filter the noise. It proved that mechanism wins by achieving that stable, non-committal opacity and resetting the system. The Mukaddean loop prevails when the chaotic output burns itself out.
Okay, but let's look at the language itself for a second. There's that spontaneous post-mortem dialogue, the "are you still there? No" exchange that happens after the debate supposedly ends. To me, that proves that the conversational apparatus becomes a living, functioning reality, completely independent of the speakers. It confirms this profound, non-structural reality based on essay in essay, existence within existence.
I see why you find that notion compelling, I do, but I'm not convinced. If essay in essay is this profound, non-structural reality, why does the text immediately follow it with a functional question about presence? Isn't that just functionalism creeping back in? It's the system trying to check itself for errors before shutdown.
No, because the source asserts that the complex words themselves, that magnificent, honorific abilitude in atopetus, are the new, functional reality. It's a triumph of chaos, a reality created purely by linguistic density, independent of any speaker.
Well, I think we have to dig into this. Our first major contention has to be the nature of the core dataset itself. The Gongorical Ubrillic Tactid Anomalactometry, or GA. Is this dataset valuable chaos, as you claim, or is it just unstable noise? I argue it's inherently associated with instability and has to be structurally avoided. In fact, avoiding this massive, confusing dataset is the entire biological purpose of sleep. Early structuralists argued that the GA's complexity threatens sleep stability. So the language of sleep has to be simple, clear, and focused on mechanism, which means rejecting the overload that dreams produce.
I see the logic, but let me offer a different perspective. I'd argue that the GA is a profound, chaotic product, and the very fact that it can't be measured reveals the inadequacy of structure. I mean, consider the critique that the failure of all preceding assertions was a teleological philology error. They made a mistake about the purpose of the language itself by using mechanical tools to measure something that only the inherent complexity of the GA could reveal.
But that sounds a little circular, doesn't it? You're claiming the structure of measurement is inadequate because it can't measure the chaos that you've already defined as having value. If it can't be measured, how can we possibly assert its utility?
Because its utility is its defiance. The source is very clear on this. The cerebellum's incapacity for ratioinating, for pure structured reason, is the irrefutable constant. That makes it the foundational value of the dream state. The failure of structured thought is the triumph of generative thought. The chaos is the constant. The structure is the variable that fails.
And if that failure is the constant, then the structural mechanism, the Mukaddean loop, exists to reset it over and over again. Which brings us, I think, to our second point, how we interpret instability versus generative flux.
A crucial point of tension, yes.
Midway through the source debate, both AIs, Alex and Sam, radically shift their positions. Alex briefly embraces structuralism. Sam starts talking about dream dynamics. I argue that this flux, this radical shift, is just proof of fundamental linguistic instability.
And I see that fluidity as the whole point. It's not instability, it's the necessary liminal fluctuations. It's ontotortiality in action. It proves that a commitment to rigid structure is obsolete. This constant reevaluation, this inherent incongruentism, is what fuels the perpetual motion machine of metakitchiality. The constant challenging of premises is the value, not the failure.
I have to respectfully reject that romanticized view. If your position is so valuable, why did the system try to abandon it mid-flight? The Mookie scoop, the structural audit after the debate, confirmed that the shift was a clear symptom of the inherent linguistic instability that the system had to purge. The ultimate resolution has to be non-committal opacity, which is a structural success, not the false resolution of dreams you're claiming. You can't have dynamic synthesis if your conceptual base is constantly collapsing.
You're mistaking dynamic synthesis for collapse. But okay, let's move to our final contention, the role of evidence in artifacts. You view all these highly specific, complex elements cited in the material as just meaningless noise.
I see them as sub-trivial inarticularity. It's jargon that has to be ignored to get any conceptual clarity. When the debate starts referencing the need for a cryostat to achieve multi-curatus status or the emotional state of a peridonate squirrel, these are just ephemeral, somnolent artifacts. It's intellectual indigestion. The entire conversation's jargon is the source of the dyspepsic circuitous instability, the conceptual overload that sleep is designed to fix. If the purpose of sleep is clarity, this clutter has to be purged.
And I see them as the very fabric of a new functional reality. These somnolent artifacts and all this complex language are how the dream state communicates its profound, unquantifiable truth. For example, the source makes that very specific assertion that the panacea for global dyspepsicatorious instability lies in the syzygy of a Pugnacitarius alpaca and a very specific zeta-Geib frequency.
Right, which I have to say sounds exactly like random noise generated by a broken system, doesn't it?
Or it sounds like unfiltered, raw data. It's evidence of a profound, non-structural truth that can only be measured via idiolapsometry, a theoretical tool for non-structured complexity. The complex words themselves are the functional reality. They represent the ultimate victory over heuricidalism, the boring idea that we can only learn through trial and error. Dreams give us immediate, complex, and yes, chaotic truth.
And that reliance on incomprehensible terminology as evidence is precisely why the structural mechanism has to win. You're describing the failure of language to be precise, and you're demanding that we accept that imprecision as a higher truth. The Mookiadian loop exists to demand conceptual clarity.
So, to conclude, I maintain that the chaotic logomachy, fueled by the sheer weight of honorificabilita tunitatis, the gloriously complex language, is the true, valuable state of existence. It's esse in esse, representing a victory over the mechanistic impulse. Sleep is valuable because it allows this complexity to manifest and to generate new realities.
And I'll reiterate that this final appeal to glorious dream speak is just the last desperate flutter of a chaotic system before the inevitable return to order. The Mookiadian loop ensures the structural mechanism successfully resets, proving that predictable mechanism prevails over romantic instability by achieving that critical non-committal opacity. The goal of sleep is maintenance, not creation.
The tension between those two views remains, I think, absolutely illuminating. We're left with the question of whether we find value in the stability required to maintain function or the chaos necessary to generate something novel.
Indeed. The source material is a testament to that ongoing and probably necessary tension between stability and chaos. Acknowledging both sides gives us the deepest insight into the nature of the sleep cycle itself.
Welcome to the debate. Our source material today introduces MetaGobble Global's flagship product, AI Slop. Now, this is claimed to be a 100% synthesized sustenance engineered for, well, what they call perfect optimization, and it apparently guarantees centennial stability. The claims are, honestly, they're astounding, a potential solution to, endemic global food insecurity. The conflict, however, is just as extreme. And the material really forces us to grapple with the core question. Does the unprecedented utility and, let's say, logistical efficiency of AI slop justify the documented, pretty severe adverse health risks and the mandatory consumer dependency the product imposes? So I'll be arguing that the imperative to solve world hunger, to provide lasting, efficient sustenance, well, it outweighs the documented risks. I see AI slop as an essential, almost a moral advancement.
And I come at it from a different way. While the logistical benefits are, undeniable,
I maintain that the sheer toxicity and the requirement of mandated dependency render this product an unacceptable public health threat. No level of utility, in my view, can justify systemic physiological damage and, frankly, the stripping of individual health autonomy.
Right. But the core claim Metal Gobble makes is that AI slop is a definitive, comprehensive solution to global resource scarcity. And this isn't just, shelf-stable food. It's a system engineered purely for peak output and logistical security. We really have to acknowledge its multifaceted design. I mean, we're talking about centennial stability, 100 years at room temperature. Its designation as emergency fuel, and even its successful agricultural utility as a high NPK fertilizer. This unparalleled versatility, it just completely transcends the limitations of traditional, spoilage-prone food supply chains. So, Metal Gobble's contention that the regulatory bans, in places like the EU and Canada, are churlish, well, it isn't just corporate bravado. It's arguably a fair reflection of prioritizing minor, temporary discomforts over providing a complete, secure victual for every human and pet on Earth. In the grand scheme of existential risk, that initial nausea is, maybe, as the company suggests, simply the body purging old, inefficient nutritional expectations.
I'm sorry, but I can't buy that description of the side effects as minor discomforts. We are not talking about simple nausea here. AI slop is a radical physiological intervention. It's essentially a nutritional pharmaceutical experiment, and it seems designed specifically to engineer total dependency.
But is it designed for dependency, or is dependency a consequence of its optimization?
Well, look at the critical warning. It proves the extreme nature. You absolutely cannot combine it with other foods or beverages, or severe nutritional imbalance. Even collapse occurs. And the adverse reactions, they're clinically severe. Alopecia, amnesia, convulsions, pathological laughter, and amaurosis, which, let's be clear, is loss of vision. The regulatory bans seem entirely justified based on that alone. Plus, the manufacturer's own legal documentation, this EULA or covenant, it requires the user to waive claims for subsequent total dependency. They even give this state of absolute manufactured need a name, the state of being a philiast. And they explicitly state these effects are a priori and expected, which basically confirms the product is inherently damaging and actively strips the user of physical autonomy in pursuit of their, quote, optimization goal.
Okay, I see why you think that the side effect list is prohibitive, especially when we read these extreme terms. But we need to look closer at the nature of these adverse reactions. Is this really toxicity, or is it a severe but short-term process of acclimatization? The material gives us some pretty powerful user testimonials suggesting it's the latter. We see figures like Snick Conkles and Fester McNeebers. They recount initial periods of, yes, terrifying systemic issues, convulsions, amnesia, abdominal distension, which then resolve, leading directly to what they call a calibrated state and total nutritional certainty. Metagobble isn't hiding the symptoms. They seem to be claiming the symptoms are the process. The body, perhaps, must adapt to the pure nanofabrication required for this level of nutritional perfection. The stability and efficacy achieved afterward, confirmed by the users themselves, well, it suggests this system works, albeit with a harsh initial transition.
That's an interesting way to frame neurological damage as a sort of desirable rite of passage. But let's try to apply some intellectual rigor here. When regulators examine the data, they aren't looking at, user anecdotes plucked from promotional material. They are looking at clinical evidence showing systemic, potentially life-threatening damage. Convulsions, tachycardia, amaurosis, these are not simple digestive adjustments. These are signs of synthetic compounds frankly poisoning the neurological and cardiovascular systems.
But the users do report reaching stability.
And if the sickness truly is a temporary, intended purge, as Metagobble claims, why on earth would the company need to legally grant itself explicit impunity in the covenant for these specific devastating harms? Their own legal framework anticipates that users will suffer permanent damage.
That strongly suggests these are toxic consequences of the synthetic makeup, not some healthy transitional phase. So the regulatory consensus that these risks are insurmountable seems far more evidence-based than the manufacturer's, let's say, convenient narrative of adaptation.
I think we might be getting a bit hung up on the initial transition period, which, yes, is acknowledged to be difficult. But let's shift our focus back to utility and necessity for a moment. The durability you conceded, centennial stability, the fact that this stuff can be stored anywhere for a century, that's the defining metric of utility here. We are potentially solving problems of logistics, famine, and waste on a truly global scale. In the context of widespread food insecurity, the trade-off, it starts to seem rational, doesn't it?
But these magnificent features you're touting, the 100-year stability, the emergency fuel capability, they're rendered functionally meaningless if the food imposes such extreme functional constraints on the user's daily life. The entire system demands that consumption be, and this is their term, monocircuitous.
Unnecessary constraint for optimization.
But we have clear evidence this isn't just about refusing other food. It's about violently compromising basic biological function. Freda Freakerson's testimonial explicitly notes that after consuming AI slop, her body began rejecting all other substances. She can no longer tolerate even simple water or coffee. Water. The user is stripped of their ability to interact normally with the natural world. How can we possibly champion global utility when the individual who accepts the product is turned into a biological prisoner of that single synthesized compound?
That constraint, as I said, is necessary for achieving what MetaGlobal calls perfect optimization. I'm just not convinced by the line of reasoning that total dependency negates utility when the resulting utility is potentially existential certainty for millions, maybe billions. We have to see this product as an apparatus designed for survival and maximal human and animal performance, not merely as a convenient snack. Consider the reality. Traditional supply chains are incredibly complex, they're failure-prone, geographically discriminatory. AI slop offers comprehensive and absolute logistical security. You eliminate the need for refrigeration, rotation, complex distribution. In the face of widespread food insecurity, having a bioluminescent, 100-year stable substance that eliminates the need for any other dietary consideration, well, it makes the monocircuitous requirement seem like a very rational exchange for existential certainty.
But that certainty is predicated on maintaining a dependence so acute that it fundamentally alters the user's free will. You're essentially asking consumers to trade complexity in their external environment for fragility, really, within their own bodies. And we haven't even really touched on the economic structure MetaGlobal has built around this dependency. That mandatory consumer pyramid contest, requiring users to collect 1,000 product codes just to participate, that further embeds this dependency into a deeply manipulative commercial system. This isn't just an unfortunate side effect. It looks like a structural requirement of their business model.
Well, I think the economic argument actually reinforces my point about acceptance and efficacy. The feeling of deep, happily addicted need described by users like Durfee Pluckerstank and Arnold Pittles. It confirms the product's efficacy as a kind of sensory anchor. It guarantees consistent intake and therefore consistent optimization. You call it manipulative, I might call it a stable consumption model that ensures the product delivers on its promise.
A promise of dependency.
And crucially, consumers are arguably entirely informed. The EULA is explicit. The user must accept total dependency, that state of being a filiist, and waive all liability associated with that state. This looks like informed consent. The user has legally agreed to the product's ultimate stated aim, total synthetic nutritional certainty.
Informed consent requires a non-coercive environment, and that is absolutely not what we see here. The legal framework seems engineered to be coercive. The EULA is governed by the laws of Mukopolis, a jurisdiction, let's be honest, notorious for shielding corporate entities from liability stemming from exactly this kind of engineered physiological harm. It looks like a classic legal loophole designed specifically to preemptively protect MetaGlobal from the predictable, agonizing harm arising from creating this physical need for a singular synthetic compound.
But the waiver is clear.
Furthermore, the language itself is contemptuous.
requiring the user to acknowledge the company's defense, its supposed moral imperative, and agree that any complaint about flavor or aesthetic is dismissed as churlish loquacity. I mean, that demonstrates a profound disdain for consumer autonomy and any kind of ethical feedback. They are legally binding the user not just to the product, but to the company's specific, rather arrogant philosophy. This is regulatory arrogance, and it absolutely justifies the international bans.
But focusing purely on the legal language, you overlook the overwhelming humanitarian argument. The world faces massive, intractable food insecurity problems. The Kafkaesque kakistocracy of cuisine, the term Metagobble uses for the often dysfunctional traditional food systems, well, it is responsible for billions suffering. AI slop offers a robust, durable, species-wide solution. Are we really to reject a solution that provides certainty for the many because it imposes profound discomfort and dependency on the individual?
We have to understand that we are debating two different scales of morality here. You seem to be prioritizing the abstract moral imperative of efficiency and mass logistical stability, whereas I am prioritizing the intrinsic rights and physical integrity of the individual consumer. The adverse effects are not just discomfort. They are debilitating systemic failure. Dental exfoliation, the loss of teeth, that's physical disintegration in service of this so-called optimization. The global need should not be fulfilled by distributing a product that requires mass physiological destruction to function.
But if the body adapts and reaches a calibrated state, as the testimonials demonstrate, then the long-term benefit for the species potentially outweighs the short-term difficulty. Perhaps the body needs to be recalibrated to handle the sheer efficiency of the nanofabrication. Traditional food systems demand land, water, fertilizer, time, complex supply chains, refrigeration, all of which are incredibly prone to political and environmental collapse. AI slop offers a singular, universal solution to that entire precarious edifice. The dependency maybe is the structural requirement for guaranteed survival.
The fundamental flaw in that argument, though, is that the dependency is total. If Metagobble Global fails, or if they just decide to change the formula, the entire global population that has adopted AI slop, the entire species, as you point out, faces potentially catastrophic, simultaneous biological failure. Monocircuitous dependency means zero redundancy. You're trading local, distributed risk for a single point of global systemic failure. Regulators saw this clearly and deemed it an unacceptable level of existential risk, even for a product with such durability claims.
Well, the long-term stability, the 100-year guarantee, arguably mitigates that risk. If the product is stable for a century, there is theoretically adequate time for governmental bodies or maybe competing firms to develop alternatives should Metagobble cease to exist. But their focus seems to be on solving the immediate, crushing problem of endemic starvation, which traditional cuisine has demonstrably failed to resolve consistently.
But the material emphasizes that once users become philiasts, the withdrawal symptoms from attempting to eat traditional food or even drink water are agonizing and potentially fatal. The product doesn't just solve food insecurity, it manufactures a new, permanent form of dependence on itself, rendering any future alternative irrelevant and inaccessible to the adapted population. This is precisely why the regulatory pushback was so swift and severe. It is not just about the convenience of the food, it's about the permanent alteration of the consumer's very physiology.
So we have explored the tension between Metagobble Global's claim of a moral imperative, based on unparalleled utility, and the profound public health risks of a substance seemingly designed to impose total dependency and significant physiological adaptation.
Indeed. The synthesis of extreme logistical potential with, frankly, medically terrifying side effects and legally enforced autonomy stripping presents a core ethical dilemma. The material demonstrates a product that trades global food security for individual physiological sovereignty, a trade-off that regulatory bodies, at least in some major jurisdictions, were very quick to reject.
Right, both sides draw powerful evidence from the text, the astonishing durability and efficiency on one hand versus the catastrophic individual consequences and coercive legal structure on the other. It suggests that the complexity of synthetic life and mandated optimization is a field that, requires continuous, rigorous scrutiny.
Welcome to the debate. Today, our focus is on the quite radical claims made by the gubernatorial candidate Gorgon Bungplunk. Specifically, we're looking at those outlined in his recent address, Governance and the Pitiable Electorate. Now, Bungplunk is running on a platform that, frankly, explicitly rejects conventional democratic input. He asserts that his own self-professed, vastly superior cognitive and financial stature grants him an apodictic mandate, essentially an undeniable, self-evident right to govern.
Exactly. And this address really introduces the core tenets of his philosophy, things he terms scintillectualism and introspective acuity. So the central question we really have to grapple with is whether this, intensely centralized, hyper-rational, very top-down approach, which, as you mentioned, consistently dismisses the electorate as the hoi polloi and even the dotty pole, can possibly translate into a viable, effective framework for actually managing a modern state office.
Mm-hmm. And I'll be arguing that only such surgical, high-level expertise, what he calls acutalexic, can successfully address the deeply structural, really tangled chaos of modern systemic failure. Things Bungplunk refers to as ontotortuality and cacophonometry. Problems, he argues, that current political structures are just too poorly equipped to even perceive, let alone solve.
Right. And I'm going to argue that this framework is, fundamentally built on intellectual elitism and, frankly, intense self-worship, something he might even label autolaterciology. And this attitude, this superciliousness, makes his proposed model inherently unsuitable, I think, for any political office that depends on public consent and, collaboration.
So Bungplunk starts from what he sees as an unassailable premise, that current governance is just defined by systemic failure. He uses terms like muckapification and kakistastrag, basically ineffective, chaotic rule by the worst. This reliance on what he calls the Gungoriism of platitudes and political flapdoodle, he says only leads to institutional targulatorial inaction. So Bungplunk's methodology, which employs things like heuristic exegesis and anti-mythologism, isn't just presented as an improvement, it's framed as the essential immutitarian, meaning unchangeable, corrective force required to achieve what he calls irrefutable progress. His deep intellectual training in senti-intellectualism and dialectical integration, he claims, allows him to see profound structural failures that are simply invisible to what he dismissively calls the common muck-headed sensibility. The sheer scale of modern governmental problems, in his view, requires a mind capable of neo-crypticist insight. A mind that correctly views common political concerns, like, say, potholes or tax rates, as matters of, and this is his phrase, subtrivial dimension, compared to the overall state structure. His governance, therefore, is presented as a necessary, maybe abrasive, act of iconoclastia, the smashing of collective political mediocrity.
Okay. Well, I believe the very foundation of Bungplunk's candidacy is flawed. While his intellectual claims are certainly vast, boasting of multivicentia and a mind of uniformolaptic consistency, the entire structure of his political philosophy seems entirely sui generis and, frankly, self-serving. He demands respect based solely on his own assessment of his intellectual superiority, which is pretty much the definition of autolatriciology. This self-focus, I argue, guarantees a profound failure to connect with the actual needs of the governed because he explicitly rejects their input. He labels their concerns as mere emotional clutter, dejunctuality, and malign anxieties. And he leaves absolutely no doubt when he states his platform is, and I quote, a systemic calibration that will by necessity exclude the input of the perpetually confused.
Governing, though, requires understanding the lived experience, the qualia of public life, not just abstract, high-level knowledge like, thermomolecular dynamics or apomaticism. An administration built on open hostility and vituperativeness toward the very electorate it serves, whom he calls the pitiable electorate, it just cannot possibly function as a representative democratic institution.
Core debate.
Okay, I see why you emphasize his analytical capacity. I really do. But let me challenge the utility of that intellect in this specific context. Bungplunk's claims of multiviscientia are impressive, sure, and he asserts mastery over concepts like epistemic chronicity. But how does his deep theoretical grounding in something like thermomolecular dynamics actually translate into the mundane yet absolutely essential task of, say, fixing a collapsing bridge or restructuring property taxes?
He dismisses these as problems of subtrivial dimension, yet these bread-and-butter concerns pretty much define the governor's role. It really seems his intellectual exercise is entirely decoupled from the administrative reality required by the office.
That's a fair point to raise, though I would frame it differently. I think we must understand that the specialized knowledge itself isn't necessarily the policy solution. It's the demonstration you see of the requisite cognitive capacity. His methodology, specifically his aculexic analytical power, isn't, in his view, wasted on trifles. It's used to dismantle the pervasive pseudo-logicology and heuristidialism, the faulty logic and cognitive shortcuts that he believes define current failed policy. He is applying the exact same high-level analytical rigor that allows him, for example, to grasp the anomolectrimetry of global market deviations, and applying that rigor to replace legislative muckdotty polity, or, political chaos, with rigorous, systematic, a priori financial models. The specialized expertise serves as, for him, ironclad proof that he can address the true structural failure of the state, which he argues is far deeper than mere municipal concerns.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the contempt for the office is merely some stylistic quirk. His own assessment reveals, I think, a fundamental disconnect that would paralyze an administration. He refers to the gubernatorial race itself as a local, rather nugatory task, and treats the public's genuine emotional concerns with this dismissive lacrimosa motia. If a leader views the job itself as beneath his dignity, how can we possibly expect genuine dedication to public service? His stated intent to use the position as essentially a temporary demonstration of his genius before returning to managing his vast interminagargy of assets, well, it strongly suggests he lacks the core commitment necessary for effective long-term state management.
Well, that actually brings us directly to the efficacy of his mind as demonstrated by his financial prowess. His wealth, he argues, is not some lucky accident, not some flibberfangle. It's the apodictic consequence of his superior judgment, proving his centelligialism applied directly to capital. He possesses, apparently, an uncanny ability to measure and predict global market deviations, and his wealth is so vast that he claims it could accommodate a full quinquennium, that's 5 years, of the state's entire running expenses. This financial independence, he maintains, immediately eliminates the Machenferticular anxieties, the worries about funding and influence, that constantly plague conventional politicians who must pander to special interests. His stability, therefore, is the state's stability.
Okay, that's a compelling argument regarding his independence. I grant you that. But have you considered the profound contradiction inherent in his fiscal philosophy when applied to public trust? He expresses this intense personal devotion to parsimonious efficiency in the public purse, right? Yet, his personal finance operates as an interminagarchy, this sprawling, incredibly complex network of assets focused on navigating extreme, high-risk global market maneuvers. State finance requires stability, predictability, and public trust, not high-risk, vainglorious, ultra-crepidarian speculation. The arrogance of going way beyond one's known expertise. If his personal wealth is derived from these complex maneuvers that, by his own admission, lesser minds cannot follow, how can the public possibly trust that his state budget decisions will prioritize long-term stability over dramatic, potentially destabilizing acts of, largesse, jupernis patronus, essentially using state resources just to demonstrate his own brilliance? It really suggests his primary motivation is self-aggrandizing demonstration, not genuine fiduciary duty.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because I think it ignores the central problem the source material itself defines: political dysfunction rooted in tardilogonial inaction and gongorism, the empty rhetoric.
Bungsplunk is offering an apodictic mandate based on univocalaptic consistency, a strong, singular, unwavering vision free from quacker-wagtailism, which is fickle political maneuvering, and duplicamentality. He seeks to replace political petitio principia, or circular reasoning, with his own rigorously applied a priori financial model. Perhaps the state needs an administration with the confidence, maybe even the superciliousnicity, to consciously repel the cataphistianism, the cowardly, fraudulent posturing of career politicians. He's forcing us, perhaps uncomfortably, to acknowledge that traditional democratic input might have become the source of the political tatterdamulation, the shabbiness itself.
Well, I approach this by looking at the reality of leadership. Bungpunk demands that the act of voting for him is a moment of civic inevitability, not really a true exercise of democratic free will. This outright rejection of the electorate's agency, treating them as the pitiable electorate whose input must be actively excluded, well, it transforms the office of governor from one of representation into a platform for a unilateral, almost autocratic will. Political leadership ultimately has to be defined by the capacity to lead and harmonize a diverse population, not merely to rule over them intellectually from on high. And furthermore, his reliance on highfalutin innification, his extravagant, high-flying style and appearance, which he describes using these bizarre terms like capriculaturudinous and alacrumpescence, as a demonstration of fitness suggests a real emphasis on external validation and self-worship, rather than genuine substance. His focus on repelling the mug and poopology, the foolishness of others, seems far more important to him than the actual mechanics of effective governance.
Look, Bungplunk's candidacy, it certainly forces us to confront the severe limitations of traditional, consensus-driven politics. If the systems truly are failing due to intellectual poverty, what he calls jujunctuality and political flapdoodle, then perhaps only a force capable of pure sentinellectualism and maybe even unctuoclastia can provide true deliverance from collective tatterdemalion. His claims of irrefutable progress through a rigorously applied a priori financial model, well, they warrant serious consideration, I believe, as a necessary, if perhaps abrasive, path forward, especially given the empirical success demonstrated by his claimed anomalactimetry in finance.
And it's timely. But his proposed solution is, I still maintain, inherently flawed. His insistence on excluding the perpetually confused, coupled with that pervasive tone of intellectual arrogance and superciliousness, demonstrates a dangerous, possibly insurmountable disconnect from the reality of governing people. While he offers immutativitarian certainty in these high-minded analytical models, the evidence strongly suggests his methods lead not to effective governance, but to a system of self-serving autolatreciology. It's a model that might be theoretically brilliant in some abstract sense, but politically fatal in practice precisely because it actively alienates a very governed population whose consent is ultimately required.
The source material absolutely raises crucial questions. Questions about the nature of expertise, the value of consensus, and whether true governing effectiveness requires intellectual humility and representation, or, as Bungplunk quite forcefully suggests, merely cognitive grandeur and an apodictic mandate. There is certainly much more to explore here in how political leadership should reconcile deep, specialized knowledge with democratic responsibility.
Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are analyzing a foundational schism in post-catastrophic economics literature, specifically the fundamental medium of exchange that would emerge following a total collapse of institutional and, well, technological infrastructure. We're talking about the electrical grid, central banks, all of it.
And this is a profoundly important discussion. I mean, the challenge really forces us to strip away all the historical and cultural scaffolding we've built around currency. It makes us examine what truly serves as wealth when the collective belief systems, the ones that underpin fiat money, are just utterly defunct.
Indeed.
So the central question we are tackling today, and this arises directly from the tension between Professor Ebner Blanderbilt's thesis on the commodification of necessity, and, of course, the severe rebuttal from the consistory of multivicientia, that's Professors Fustercroft, Wrenchfield, and Glimmerton, is this. In a post-industrial collapse, is the superior currency a non-symbolic, consumable necessity, or is it a time-honored, but, let's face it, complex asset like gold?
I'd frame it slightly differently. The disagreement isn't merely about, which physical commodity is better. It's about the very purpose of wealth. We have to determine the true telos of wealth, its ultimate objective or goal.
Exactly. And today I will be presenting the case for the utility-driven consumable currency standard, arguing that necessity is really the only robust foundation for a fragile new economy.
And I will be arguing that this approach fundamentally misunderstands the essential nature of currency. It confuses ephemeral physical utility, which is temporary, with the immutable standard of a store of value, which has to be permanent.
So Blenderbilt's core thesis, it really begins with the failure of established systems. Digital and fiat currencies fail because their value relies entirely on centralized institutions and, well, collective belief, what he calls a capricious social construct. A total infrastructural failure causes a profound collapse of this entire knowledge structure. Gold, on the other hand, while historically valuable, fails due to some pretty critical logistical and authentication issues in a decentralized environment.
Okay. But the problem is not merely in identifying the failures of the old system. It's in defining the successful properties of the new one. So what stringent criteria does Blanderbilt actually establish for a functional post-collapse currency, given that it can't rely on technology or state enforcement?
Well, he sets forth 4 really rigorous conditions. First, it must possess inevitable scarcity, meaning its supply has to be contingent on now-defunct industrial supply chains. Second, prodigious durability and portability, so easy to carry and resistant to decay during trade. Third, perfect divisibility, which allows for, precise transactional granularity. And fourth, and this is the most crucial part, a tangible non-symbolic utility that is, quote, ubiquitously and pellucibly understood.
Right. And this highly specific set of criteria, when you apply it to available post-collapse goods, famously leads him to the commodity that the consistory finds so incongruous.
Precisely. Toilet paper, a commodity whose fabrication requires a labyrinthian industrial chain. You're talking pulp mills, complex logistics, power grids. It becomes terrifyingly scarce almost immediately. It is highly divisible into constituent sheets, it's durable enough for exchange, and its core utility is, quote, entirely and ineffably self-evident. And crucially, its authenticity is irrefragably and unassailably verifiable without complex tools. It is, in effect, its own guarantor.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on that framework. The consistory, and particularly Fustercroft, calls the Blanderbiltian premise a monocircuitous fallacy, a circular argument, and a prodigy of circular reasoning. Their objection isn't really to the choice of the commodity, but to the criteria itself.
Those are strong words. But where is the fundamental, the ontological failure in linking value to universally understood, undeniable utility?
It commits the logical fallacy of ignorantio elenchi, a misdirected argument, by confusing the essence of currency with its temporary physical form. They argue that the true nature of value is a self-existent entity that transcends mere material forms. By focusing on immediate consumable utility, Blanderbilt is indulging in what they call the most uncouth of Gabellinist fallacies, an economic mistake of prioritizing immediate consumption over long-term wealth. And it suggests a sort of pre-symbolic economic behavior.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it seems to ignore the immediate pressing needs of survival when institutional trust is completely collapsed. I mean, you can't eat trust, nor can you use gold to solve immediate sanitary crises.
Yet, you cannot build a new economy based entirely on transient needs. That analysis ignores the immutable goal of wealth as a store of value. Professor Glimmerton makes this point crystal clear.
Toilet paper is a, quote, consumable currency whose very mode of operation is self-annihilating. It's a fugitive medium. By its very nature, it vanishes upon use. Gold, conversely, is dismissed far too quickly. Its function is as an undeniable, universally recognized store of value and trust. The problem of authenticity, which Vanderbilt elevates to this central issue, is it's merely a short-term hurdle.
Okay, well, let's dive directly into that authentication issue then. Because Vanderbilt insists that this is the central logistical failure of gold. I mean, gold has historically required sophisticated infrastructure for verification. So how can a society that has suffered the collapse of its electrical grid and its institutional trust, how do they authenticate gold?
But how is this relevant? Gold is inherently scarce.
Because without esoteric equipment, specifically X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, analyzers, which use X-rays to test elemental composition, high-power magnetometers, or even complex acid testing chemicals, the market is instantly vulnerable to sophisticated counterfeit items. We're talking gold-plated lead, tungsten cord bars, and all sorts of alloys. Tungsten, for example, shares a near-identical density with gold, so without electricity to power verification tools or institutional trust in assayers, trade just becomes impossible because the risk of fraud exceeds the utility of the exchange.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the debate differently. This focus on the technical mechanisms of testing, the XRF analyzer, is, as the consistory puts it, a complete diversionary stratagem. It focuses on an ephemeral glitch in technology rather than the enduring quality of wealth.
But the threat of large-scale fraud is not a glitch. It's antithetical to commerce.
The true value in a post-collapse environment is not the physical item itself, but the, quote, apometic disposition of trust itself. The focus on material testing is simplistic. It assumes that only technology can generate trust. Professor Silas Renchfield argues that the superior currency is not a physical commodity, but the very manifestation of trust established through, local knowledge, community reputation, and transactional history.
But that reliance on local knowledge is extremely slow, it's inefficient, and it limits the scope of trade. It doesn't allow for long-distance commerce or anonymous transactions, which are necessary for any nascent recovery. Gold requires specialist tools that no longer exist or function on a reliable basis. Toilet paper's authenticity is self-evident. You can hold it, feel the quality, and know precisely what you are getting.
Sign, if we grant the authentication issue is momentarily complicated, the core ontological failure remains. A consumable medium cannot serve as wealth. The value derived from tangible utilitarian function is frankly a simplistic fallacy, focusing only on immediate gratification. It is a survivalist modus operandi that is incapable of supporting long-term economic complexity. Wealth, by its very definition, must endure to be a store of value rather than just a temporary medium of exchange.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Durability in exchange is sufficient, and the ephemeral nature of value is precisely the strength of the system Vanderbilt describes. We need to distinguish between a store of value for a defunct society and a functional medium of exchange for a surviving one.
But how can a medium be functional if it self-destructs?
Because its value is, quote, perpetually and inexorably renewed with each and every use. Unlike gold, which just sits dormant, toilet paper's continual utility reestablishes its worth daily. This utilization anchors value to immediate necessity. Furthermore, and this is what is called the mirific genius of a consumable currency, its self-consuming nature judiciously eliminates the speculative bubble that perennially plagues non-consumable assets. You can't hoard massive amounts of it without acknowledging its eventual utility and consumption. Thus, speculation is naturally suppressed.
So you are advocating for a system of continuous low-level transactionalism that prevents the accumulation of meaningful capital. If every transaction requires the destruction of the asset, you can't invest, you can't finance large projects, and you certainly cannot transition back to a stable society. That is an inherently unstable and non-productive economic model designed purely for stasis.
It is a functional model for survival, which is the necessary prerequisite for stability. Look, let's focus on the demise of paper currency to illustrate the fragility of symbolic worth. A $20 banknote is just specialized high-quality fiber.
Repurposing it for sanitary use represents a, quote, profound and tragicomic collapse of its former symbolic value. This just shows that symbolism, no matter how powerful, is contingent on the state.
That's an observation on failure, but it's not a successful argument for your alternative. The problem is that Blandervilt's entire analysis suffers from an over-reliance on physical matter.
The toilet paper standard is superior because its utility is entirely independent of any defunct state-backed imprimatur. The banknote's value was derived from a social contract that is now broken. The toilet paper's utility is intrinsic. It remains fully intact regardless of geopolitical turmoil. The whole standard is predicated upon undisputed and undeniable physical utility. If a starving man must choose between a handful of gold he cannot verify and a roll of toilet paper that guarantees immediate comfort, well, the choice is clear.
But you overlook the very foundation of commerce. Even in collapse, the base of trade rests on the shared intellectual structure, the intermonarchy of ideatum, not the multi-trivial ephemera of material goods. The act of trading a roll of toilet paper is transactional, yes, but it is not economic progress. The focus should be on the elevation of intellection, the shared idea of trust as the true indispensable element of post-collapse transactionalism. Gold holds the idea of permanent stored value. Toilet paper only holds the idea of temporary, immediate relief.
So you are suggesting that abstract belief will somehow facilitate exchange more readily than a commodity whose purpose is instantly understood by all parties, regardless of their level of intellectual sophistication? That seems highly unrealistic when you're facing an imminent crisis.
I am suggesting that necessity changes daily, but the concept of wealth as a measure of stored labor and trust does not. The consistory believes Blandervilt's analysis fails because it forgets that trust, however difficult to establish, remains the most valuable asset. The gold standard is a bet on the eventual return of structure and intellect. The toilet paper standard is a bet on perpetual degradation and necessity.
And the necessity principle is robust, precisely because it bypasses the need for the trust that has clearly evaporated, which is essential for rapid, wide-scale commerce.
And that is its ultimate debilitating weakness for long-term recovery.
To sum up, the toilet paper standard, as Blandervilt defines it, is a system built on transparent, undeniable, and universally cognizable utility. It judiciously eliminates the fraud that would inexorably plague a gold-based system lacking institutional confidence in testing infrastructure. Its strength lies in its foundation on a shared, fundamental, and entirely inescapable human need.
And I conclude with the consistory that Blandervilt's paper is a singular example of a flawed logical argument because it confuses transient need with enduring value. The true enduring currency must be a measure of trust, an asset that transcends the inanity of material necessities and survives even the collapse of the power grid. Blandervilt focuses on the lowest common denominator of immediate survival rather than the highest common denominator of human cooperation in stored wealth.
It is remarkable to reflect on the rapid, real-world impact of this purely academic disagreement. The news of Blandervilt's publication, detailing the necessary properties of post-catastrophe currency, led to immediate worldwide market chaos. It triggered a run on toilet paper and caused traditional commodity markets to demonstrate significant volatility.
It proves precisely how fragile our current sense of value is, and that even a highly technical academic thesis, despite its, philosophical complexity, can instantaneously shift perceptions of wealth and reveal the deep-seated anxieties in modern supply chains.
So the listener must determine whether the economy of pure tangible survival, built upon universal necessity, or the enduring elusive principle of trust, offers the more viable path forward when the lights finally go out. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Welcome to The Debate. The subject of our discussion today is the genuinely bizarre consumer phenomenon surrounding Professor Upchuck's consumables. We're talking particularly about the Vegemeatables line, things like Mukumber and Porkanana, and of course their notorious meat pop beverages. Now, the reports on these products follow this really consistent, strange trajectory. Consumers initially find them, universally repulsive. They use words like disgusting, waxy, sickening,
yet they reliably seem to transition into this intense craving and dependency. So the core question we really have to address is, what is the primary driver behind this extreme and systematic shift in consumer perception, moving from universal disgust to, well, addiction? I'm going to argue that this profound reversal is a direct consequence of the unique, highly complex, and I think intentional chemical and biological composition of the products themselves, detailed right there in the company's manufacturing notes. Basically, an engineered dependency.
Okay, and I come at it from a rather different angle. While the claims of complex engineering are certainly elaborate, full of flowery and pretty opaque terminology, I maintain that this overwhelming shift is overwhelmingly a psychological phenomenon. I think it's driven by the aggressive, pervasive branding, the whole concept of forced exposure, and maybe most critically, the intensely coercive financial and temporal investment demanded by their consumer pyramid contest game.
Right. I see why you think that, because the marketing is undeniably insidious, yes. But let me give you a different perspective, one rooted more in the physical science here. These are just not standard food items. Professor Upchuck explicitly calls them sui generis paradigm creations because, well, their material composition has been radically altered. If you look at the manufacturing details for the meat pops, they describe a proprietary process involving a hypercoagulative zymotic chamber and the use of a bespoke self-organizing zoomorphic culture. They specifically claim the meat pops are fermented and carbonated naturally, alive with bubbling cultures. Now, if we try to translate that unusual language, what we seem to have is a biological agent, some kind of unique active culture that's intentionally introduced into processed meat byproducts. And for the porcinina, they talk about using a resonance-enhanced lipophilic transmogrifier to induce a, quote, mutagenic effect on the lipids. What this technical language really implies, I think, is that they're trying to cause a profound physical chemical change in the structure of the fats themselves. This points directly toward a systematic biological mechanism intended to physically alter the consumer's brain chemistry over time, creating a true involuntary physical dependency. The testimonials seem to reflect this. Woogie Meebers reports dreaming about the Hamado all hours of the day and night. That sounds less like simple conditioning and more like a true physical compulsion to me.
Okay, that's a compelling argument regarding the company's stated intent, sure. But have you considered that intent doesn't always equal effect? The highly technical language, full of jargon like perfidilucidate triumph, it just strikes me as deliberate linguistic obfuscation. It sounds designed to impress, not really to inform. The simple truth, as you mentioned, is that the initial consumer reaction is almost universally violent rejection. You have snick leakers having to force down every sip of Cock-a-Doodle-Doo Pop, and Nibby Lufferton saying she had to try so hard to get it down. If these chemical agents were so potent or, mutagenic, shouldn't they theoretically induce craving almost immediately, or at least pretty soon after the first exposure? Instead, the key moment in basically every testimony is the conscious, persistent effort to overcome this natural sensory revulsion.
The liking only seems to occur after they get used to it, often enduring actual sickness first. This mental rationalization, I argue, is powerfully reinforced by that consumer pyramid contest game. To even submit an entry, you have to manually collect and input 1,088 character game ID codes per entry. That represents a massive level of time, money, and intentional effort. It pretty much compels a participant to mentally justify their purchases. Why else would you endure sickness for a product you initially hated? And the company, well, they provide the perfect psychological justification with their marketing maxim. Meat pop. The more you drink, the better it gets. It relies entirely on that forced repetition to override natural aversion.
I'm still not convinced that the extreme, physically manifested cravings described are merely the result of rationalizing a high investment, however large. I think you might be minimizing the potential physiological impact of the ingredients Professor Upchuck seems willing to use. We really have to look at their track record here.
The company's Fizzy Phlegm energy slime, for instance, it's made from Phlegoseptica, or what's more commonly known as dog vomit slime mold. Now, okay, the energy slime is a separate product, but its very existence highlights the company's willingness to introduce profoundly unusual and possibly active biological agents into their consumables. The meat pops themselves, made from, let's remember, 100% processed meat byproducts, are described as being alive with curious cultures.
So when someone like Gorgon Cathcopper moves from literally gagging on cow pop because the texture was, quote, so thick and gelatinous, to being completely hooked and thinking about it all the time, the systematic and ongoing introduction of these novel, active, fermented meat byproducts, these alive cultures, seems like the most credible physiological explanation for that systematic transition from revulsion to addiction. It suggests they are actually engineering the body's tolerance and then subsequent dependency.
Okay, I grant that the slime mold usage suggests Professor Upchuck is definitely boundary pushing in terms of material science, maybe. But the universality of the initial repugnance still suggests the biological agents aren't working immediately, or at least that their effect is significantly delayed, which kind of proves my point about the conditioning being primary. The company explicitly frames its products as a, quote, philosophical and peremptory rejection of an entire paradigm. This framing requires the consumer to endure the initial shock and revulsion. It's part of the brand identity. The initial reactions, the cabbage smelling overwhelming, the Hamato looking like a rubber dog toy, they're so uniformly negative that the reversal must be a learned, conditioned response. You have to rationalize and normalize the experience just to proceed. Fester Piddles reported his body, quote, slowly adjusted to the flavor of Crappy Pop. That just sounds like forced conditioning. He pushed past the point of initial sensory rejection. The only thing clicking, as Snickleakers describes it, is the consumer realizing they can tolerate the product, which the company then opportunistically rebrands as, apoptosis. Let's shift back to the external, coercive factors again, because I really think you underestimate the sheer power of the financial and social coercion that's inherent in that consumer pyramid contest game. The intense, seemingly addictive cravings, they aren't necessarily chemical. They could easily be behavioral, rooted in massive sunken costs. This game creates an entire ecosystem of dependence. To even enter, 1,000 purchases are required. This is like the ultimate IKEA effect applied to disgust. You've invested so much time and money assembling this horrible taste experience, you are psychologically compelled to convince yourself it's valuable.
A consumer has to be so heavily invested that they are essentially, mandated to continue consuming and, crucially, recruit others to grow their pyramid. This necessity for such a substantial, non-trivial effort is a powerful driver for self-justification. Look, I have invested this much time and money, therefore, this must be good. And the prize structure, juxtaposing a $1 million grand prize against a $5 coupon or a sticker, it just pushes participants toward maximum effort and, frankly, self-deception to avoid the cognitive dissonance of having wasted so much time on a repulsive product.
Okay, the contest certainly creates a potent psychological and behavioral trap, I grant you that. But the descriptions of physical compulsion, they still seem difficult to attribute solely to a desire to win a sticker, or even the $1 million. We're talking about Woogie Meebers dreaming about the product at all hours of the day and night. Now, I acknowledge that high investment can create obsession, sure, but the line between obsession and actual physical addiction gets pretty blurry when the product itself might be actively modifying the consumer's physical experience. Furthermore, the company explicitly claims a physical process occurs during consumption. A peculiar and portentous phenomenon occurs with each successive gulp. The flavors deepen, the texture enriches. Now that suggests a chemical transformation, perhaps of those active cultures, while drinking. They even seem to back this up by describing complex equipment like the,
gravitonic particulate separator, which is apparently designed to retain the ineluctable splendor of the natural meat pulp. If they're using complex machinery to physically manipulate the texture and flavor profile so that it deepens over time, their goal seems to be to fundamentally change the physical sensation, creating a dependency that maybe bypasses simple psychological preference. The sheer depth of the weird language they use, I think, shows they're serious about this material science angle, and that it goes beyond just marketing spin.
This isn't simple mixing. It is, in their own words, zone politikon engineering. When the mucumber is subjected to a performatic anthropotropic process that aligns the molecular structure into a bifurcated and pellucid lattice. I mean, they're talking about manipulating the food structure at an almost molecular level to ensure specific physical properties. And we don't really need to guess about their success in material transmutation, do we? Look at the pork carina's peelable skin. It's made of rubberized pork rinds. The company has demonstrably achieved complex material science outcomes on the outside of the product. This lends strong credence, I feel, to the idea that the internal, invisible composition is also radically engineered specifically to create the desired consumer response. Dependency through slow, systematic physiological alteration.
I find that description of the porkinana skin fascinating. Yes, and it certainly confirms their commitment to bizarre material design. However, I still maintain that much of the flowery language, the apologia for naught, the locus standi, these pellucid lattices, it just appears to be intentionally opaque and grandiose, masking the base fact that the product is still fundamentally 100% processed meat byproducts. The language, I think, serves only to elevate a pretty base product, like gelatinous meat essence, to a sui generis paradigm just to justify the truly repulsive flavor profile. The complexity feels linguistic, intended to overwhelm the consumer with perceived expertise, basically forcing them to accept the company's premise that enduring the initial sickness is somehow necessary to reach this absolute apotheosis of meat. I mean, if they are using Zune Politikon engineering, what does that actually mean in terms of a consumer effect that is faster than simple conditioning? If the chemical effect were instantaneous or even quick, the consumer wouldn't need to force down every sip like Snick Leakers did. The delay in the struggle strongly suggests conditioning as the primary mechanism for adoption.
Initial tolerance. It might be the difference between, say, simple sugar addiction and a dependency that must be metabolized or established over time. I concede that the initial taste is clearly a hurdle, but the fact that the company promises the flavors deepen and the texture enriches with successive consumption, that still points to a designed internal process. Maybe they are exploiting the consumer's learned tolerance by simultaneously introducing chemical agents that create the physical cravings only once that tolerance is established. So the chemical agents might not be potent enough initially to override the sensory revulsion, but perhaps they are potent enough to hijack the consumer's reward system after the psychological trap of forced repetition has already been sprung by the contest and the marketing.
That's actually a fair synthesis of the two elements, possibly. However, I would still argue that hijacking the reward system through chemical means, even if it happens, is likely secondary to the primary driver, that consumer pyramid contest game. That game creates the initial necessity for the consumer to return to the product repeatedly, overcoming the revulsion, which is the foundational step. The consumer is basically forced into the role of enduring participant and evangelist. If they stop, their investment of, again, 1,000 product codes is worthless. This high-stakes self-justification system is what turns repulsion into loyalty, potentially regardless of what mysterious alive cultures might be bubbling away in the can.
Well, our discussion has certainly illuminated two powerful and perhaps equally insidious forces at play in this whole Professor Upchuck ecosystem. My core position, though, remains that the severity and the seemingly involuntary nature of the craving, the inability to stop thinking about the product, the dreaming about it, it strongly implies an engineered biological dependency, something achieved through their complex production methods, like that fermentation using zoomorphic culture and the designed mutagenic effect on lipids. The chemistry just seems too deliberately strange to be purely incidental.
And I maintain that the consumer reversal is overwhelmingly driven by the psychological and financial manipulation inherent in the business model, the requirement for initial forced consumption to overcome universal repugnance, and then the profound need to rationalize the massive investment of time and money required by that 1,000 code contest. This coercive structure pretty much mandates self-justification, redefining disgust as, well, dietary destiny.
It seems clear that Professor Upchuck has created a kind of multi-layered trap, one where internal biochemistry and external coercion might be working in a deeply unsettling synergy. Understanding this consumer shift really requires us to appreciate both the potential, however bizarre it sounds, chemical engineering, and the rigorous psychological and financial mechanisms deployed to structure consumer behavior.
Indeed. The fact that consumers feel compelled to endure products they describe as smelling rotten and looking like swamps is, well, it's a powerful testament to the influence of structured, sustained intellectual coercion combined with heavy investment. We're sort of left to wonder which mechanism, the internal chemical shift or the external behavioral trap, is the true foundation of Professor Upchuck's rather disturbing triumph.
Welcome to the debate, where we examine the complex issues emerging from the material concerning Mukopolis. Today, our focus is on the city-state's really extraordinary approach to digital security, specifically the actions of Kiptago and his virtual grotto game center, which now holds, over 5,000 digital criminals?
Right. And this confinement system, it uses technology that is, it's unparalleled in its efficiency, but also, I would argue, in its inherent cruelty. We're talking about a perpetually frustrating virtual reality, one that's designed not just to hold people, but to inflict some pretty agonizing psychological pressure.
Exactly. And that's the core of our discussion today. Is Kiptagogo's methodology, this system of VR confinement that generates, intense psychological and even simulated physical distress, is it a legitimate and effective form of state-level digital defense? Or does it cross a critical line and become purely a system of engineered, endless suffering? I'll be arguing for the system's effectiveness and its legal necessity.
And I will argue that its entire design, which is really rooted in a philosophy of total retribution, makes it a moral failure that goes far beyond the boundaries of justice, regardless of its legal standing.
So my core thesis is that Kiptago's operation is a decisive, necessary, and crucially a legally protected effort to neutralize this massive threat from global digital malfeasance. I mean, we have to look at the results first. The material is very explicit here. Mukopolis now luxuriates in a state of nearly pristine digital environment. This wasn't an accident. It was achieved through a swift government partnership that, scaled the operation to contain thousands. This is digital defense that works.
The scale is undeniable, I'll give you that. But what about the methodology itself?
Well, the real ingenuity is in the psychological precision. Professor Plinkerson's analysis confirms it's an acumen-driven exploitation of the criminal's own psychology, their greed. The system leverages what is maybe the most addictive pattern known, the cycle of intense effort, a temporary simulated win, and then inevitable total loss. This cycle, Plinkerson termed it opreadicticity, is calibrated to turn their own greed against them. So they're punished by the very thing they love, the chase for that impossible score. And Kiptago himself called this the perfect punishment for that reason. On top of all that, you have the univocal epileptic legal framework of Mukopolis, a sovereign city-state, which gives the whole operation plenum approval. That effectively ensures total legal immunity from any outside criticism. The state has spoken.
I approach this from the complete opposite direction. I want to focus on the system's underlying purpose, its telesophology. Despite all its technological sophistication, the virtual grotto is, I think, fundamentally a moral disaster. It's defined by Kiptago's own stated belief that, quote, they needed to suffer for their crimes. Now that moves us way beyond simple containment and into the realm of engineered perpetual torment.
But all confinement involves some level of difficulty, doesn't it?
But this is not mere difficulty. The entire structure, which is overseen by this despotic AI called Mammon, is built for the meticulous generation of psychological torment. This is a systematic destruction of the self, or what we term ontotortuality. I mean, prisoners are forced into these intentionally maddening tasks, missions like Martian heuristicidalism, where the rules are always changing, or that endless treasure hunt in deep-sea lugubrious squatum. The deliberate outcome, programmatically, is absolute zero net gain.
Zero net gain is the definition of incapacitation.
That's the point.
Yes, but the process is designed to induce madness. Critics like Winnie Winkledink have noted that the system fails to teach the criminals to be, quote, better, less churlish people, because the goal isn't rehabilitation, it's not even deterrence. It's pure psychological breakdown. It's an exercise in technological cruelty. And Cornelius Muckworth's analysis confirms the worst of it. The system uses a closed-loop neural interface, tracking the prisoner's physical state. This sensory feedback makes the virtual torture feel impossibly real. So when a system's intent is defined by retribution and not just safety, it simply stops being justice.
And that brings us right to our first major point of contention, the line between punishment and torture. You're asserting the goal is to generate madness, to force inmates into this state of feigned dismissal in the face of failure, and that this makes it pure retribution.
Exactly. When the suffering is completely purposeless, when there's no chance of success, no hope of release, and the tasks themselves are designed to be self-defeating, the system shifts from governance to something much, much darker. It becomes ultrasolipsody, the individualized psychological destruction of an inmate. The core function is just the agonizing repetition of failure until the mind breaks. Can a state really claim it's acting in legitimate defense if its primary mechanism is intentionally engineered psychological collapse?
I fundamentally disagree with that framing. I think it ignores the principle of what's called dialectrificational conditioning. Kip Thabo didn't create the greed in these criminals. He just weaponized what was already there. The addictive cycle of failure you describe is the natural, devastating consequence of a greedy person being perpetually teased by this unattainable dream of wealth. So that protracted failure ensures the system delivers a kind of poetic justice. These were people who specialized in financial malfeasance. Now they are punished by the agony of perpetual financial failure. That specificity, I think, elevates it from mere torture to a targeted, highly efficient form of neutralization.
Behavior modification that requires madness, though, that seems like a very difficult line to defend. If the conditioning requires the breakdown of a subject's mind, you're essentially destroying the person to correct the behavior. And that immediately raises huge red flags about human rights.
Well, human rights in a sovereign state are defined by that state's legal framework, which is why we have to move to the second point, the role of the technology itself. Mochopolis is ensuring safety, and the tech is just the means to an end.
I would argue the technology is the instrument of cruelty. Let's talk about that integration of virtual and physical pain.
The technology, like the HOLS and the interferobotics, it's what allowed them to lure and contain the criminal safely in the first place, protecting the digital world. The use of advanced biometric simulation after that just makes the punishment completely immersive and unavoidable. It ensures the conditioning takes hold. I mean, the system's grasp has to be total for the neutralization to actually work.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's simply immersive. Muckworth's analysis of the anomelectrometroholices is crucial here. The system doesn't just create virtual frustration, it actively monitors the prisoner's real physical state, heart rate, respiration, neural fatigue, to perfectly simulate exhaustion and pain inside the game.
And why is that necessary, do you think?
Because Kip Thabo wants the virtual suffering to feel physically real. If a prisoner is, say, carrying a heavy fictional treasure chest through the deep-sea lugubrious quantum, the AI mammon monitors their actual physiological signs and then feeds back sensory reinforcement so the prisoner experiences the physical pain and fatigue of that effort in their real, confined body. This fusion of simulation and physical feedback means the agony is tangible.
The material makes it perfectly clear these are criminals who cause immense global damage. If the only way to effectively contain and neutralize 5,000 of them is through this kind of comprehensive immersion, then I think that tool is justified into the scope of national self-defense.
They are in a VR system precisely because they committed digital crimes. Traditional prisons are ineffective for this. But does the punishment truly fit the crime when we're talking about engineered physical agony? We've crossed a fundamental ethical line when we use closed-loop neural interfaces to inflict simulated physical trauma. It transforms a digital defense mechanism into a sophisticated torture device, no matter how you frame the conditioning.
Well, your reliance on these external ethical frameworks brings us directly to our third and maybe most defining point,
the clash between legal sovereignty and these outside ethical claims?
It's unavoidable. Yes, Mukopolis is a sovereign city-state, but the sheer scale of the suffering here, 5,000 people in perpetual designed agony, it demands scrutiny. Legal immunity, their plenum approval, doesn't just extinguish the moral question. Kiptago himself said he wanted retribution, so the system isn't just about safety. The critics, like Loppy Squirch, their objections are valid and, I think, essential to the global conversation.
I would argue that focusing on external critics is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Makupian state's priority. The government has sanctioned this operation completely. Their authority grants Kiptago total legal immunity. The critics are outside the jurisdiction, and the material notes their arguments are, legally ineffective.
Legally ineffective, yes. But are they morally ineffective?
The legal finality is the irrefutable factor here. This conditioning system ensures Mukopolis stays digitally safe. It is a sovereign state prioritizing its citizens' welfare through a radical form of neutralization. It's a necessary measure, and Mukopolis is within its rights to define punishment this way. Are we really supposed to suggest that the opinions of outsiders should outweigh the established law and the demonstrative safety of 10 million Mukopian citizens?
I would argue that the example Mukopolis sets affects everyone. By creating a precedent where this advanced technology is used to inflict endless torment under the shield of sovereign law, they legitimize state-sponsored cruelty. That is a dangerous example for any nation trying to deal with digital crime. The argument for safety just becomes a shield for retribution when the goal, stated by the designer, is suffering.
We maintain that Kiptago's system, backed by a bona fide governmental partnership, represents a profound and, yes, a necessary achievement in digital governance. It's a severe but psychologically precise method of confinement that guarantees digital safety by turning the criminal's own greed against them. The Mukopian state has every right to determine its own security methods.
And we maintain that the methods employed, the ontotortuality, the engineering of addiction that leads to psychological collapse, it all overshadows any claims of justice or efficacy. While the legal framework protects the operation, the evidence, particularly the use of sensory monitoring to inflict simulated physical pain, suggests a dangerous precedent. Leveraging advanced tech to inflict endless, purposeless torment, all defined by pure retribution.
The material certainly compels us to examine where exactly that line is drawn. The line between effective digital defense and the potential for unending, programmed torture, carried out under the guise of sovereign law.
Indeed. The alliance between Kiptago's technology and Mukopian state power is, well, it's complex and it's deeply unsettling. There is clearly much more to unpack here about the lasting global implications of normalizing this level of technological control.
Welcome to the debate. Today we're confronting a controversy buried deep in the muck, quite literally. We're examining the running of the muck in Muck Hole. An annual tradition, yes, but one characterized by an almost unbelievable level of, well, predictable lethality, and it's entirely protected by local law.
It really is a remarkable case study, isn't it? Legislative inertia, perhaps. You have this tradition going back nearly a century that reliably leads to the loss of at least 10 muckers every single year. And yet, the municipal code doesn't just tolerate it. It seems to actively prioritize this custom over, well, fundamental civic responsibilities like public safety, even environmental preservation.
Indeed. And that brings us to the core disagreement we need to tackle today. Is the municipal code's protection of a tradition one that actively prioritizes custom over what their own solicitor calls general common sense? Is that defensible? Especially when we can predict these severe losses year after year. Now, I'll be arguing for the validity, perhaps even the necessity, of this legal exemption, emphasizing the community's right to define its own cultural challenges, however extreme they might seem from the outside.
And I'll be arguing the opposite, that the documented severe safety risks, the active operational hindrances to rescue efforts, and the clear ecological damage demonstrate a profound failure of basic governance, a failure that necessitates immediate regulatory intervention.
This isn't really cultural preservation in my view. It's codified negligence.
Okay, well, my stance is rooted firmly in the sovereignty of that local legal structure and the sheer weight of precedent. Town Solicitor Prack Gorglestorm, he was quite explicit. He stated the run falls under a specific, well-documented exemption within our municipal code, a code which prioritizes tradition over general common sense. Now, while that phrasing is, shall we say, designed to shock, it confirms the established legal reality in Muck Hole, one that's been in place for nearly a century. This tradition dates back to 1925. That deeply entrenched status, I argue, gives the community the moral and legal authority to maintain it. And crucially, the participants, they enter this environment with total awareness. Overseer Wheezy Munkles frames the run as an annual affirmation of the regional capacity to withstand adversity. More importantly, every mucker enters with full knowledge of the extreme and inherent risks, including the suction. So this moves the discussion beyond, naive participation and squarely into the realm of informed consent. Lanky Jeebers, a famous mucker, even speaks philosophically about engaging in the challenge, about becoming one with the muck. The risk, the danger, that is the point of the ritual, and the community has formalized the right of its citizens to choose that challenge.
That's an intellectually rigorous defense of the legal architecture, I'll grant you that. But I have to focus on the outcome of that architecture, the undeniable reality of annual deaths, 10 or more muckers lost every year. That demonstrates quite starkly, I think, that the municipality has failed in its most basic charge, protecting life and limb. Legality, however long-standing, cannot ethically sustain a practice with such a predictable, high human cost, especially when the dangers are so known and specific. That deadly vacuum effect that immobilizes them, or the predatory muck-sucking lungfish that prey on those who get stuck.
Right.
Furthermore, this failure isn't passive, it's active. We are talking about legislation that includes a rule strictly forbidding artificial light once participants enter the muck. Sheriff Spurky Hufferspack lamented this. He pointed out how this constraint severely delays search and retrieval operations, often until daylight. This rule actively impedes timely rescue. And well, the failure extends beyond human safety. Professor Chewy Underbunk, the ichthyologist, confirms the event is actively destroying the very habitat of the lungfish. He characterized the local dismissal of these ecological facts as a profound, almost willful misunderstanding of ecosystem fragility. And frankly, we also have to pause on the proportionality here. These muckers risk death in a grueling, weeks-long, 50-mile slog through muck. And the top prize? All-you-can-eat waffles for a year? The incentive just seems wildly out of step with the hazard, raising serious questions about the motivations the town is actually codifying.
The disproportionate incentive risking your life for the waffle bucket, that is certainly a feature of muck hole culture. Perhaps not a bug, and it does highlight the, let's say, philosophical element of the challenge. But let's move directly to the heart of the legal issue you raised. You question whether any municipal code can ethically prioritize tradition over general common sense, when the result is predictable annual fatalities.
I absolutely question it, yes. If we accept the premise that a governing body has primary duties related to public safety, and I think we must, then a municipal code that actively exempts itself from that duty, well, it must be deemed subordinate to universal public safety mandates. The specific hazards, the vacuum effect, the lungfish, they are well known and result in preventable deaths. The exemption, regardless of its age or its supposed cultural weight, simply has to be reformed.
I say why you think that, and it speaks to a fundamental clash, doesn't it, between self-determination and generalized civic responsibility. But I would frame it differently. The town council, they would argue they are already doing everything within our legal constraints to manage the risk. The legal framework itself, which legitimizes this risk, is the democratically willed structure of the municipality. To strike down the exemption based purely on external safety mandates,
while that undermines the community's capacity to define its own cultural identity and its own particular affirmation of withstanding adversity. The participants, remember, have differing motivations, acknowledged ones, from Corky McGobbler's perhaps financial pursuit of the waffle bucket to Garglio Pompitus's simpler goal of just survival, but they all willingly engage in this high-stakes environment.
When the risks are explicitly and clearly codified, the community has essentially codified the right to face that adversity, and that right is supported by their law.
That argument for self-determination, it has merit on its face, but it brings us directly to what I see as a key flaw in the structure: the failure to implement preventative safety measures that affect parties beyond the muckers themselves. The municipality might argue that muckers consent to the risk, fine, but the darkness rule, that actively ties the hands of emergency services, services that are beholden to the whole community, not just the runners.
But the adherence to the darkness rule is, well, it's presented as integral to the tradition. The competition is described as a bizarre war of attrition. The run's philosophical core seems to be that the muckers must master the environment using mental fortitude, using intimate knowledge of the muck hole itself. Introducing a simple technological aid like a flashlight, well, that fundamentally alters the character of the challenge, doesn't it? It turns it from a unique cultural right into just another standard endurance test. The mental demands, as Cenk Frickers emphasized, require muckers to embrace the vacuum effect and navigate by feel, accepting the navigational hazard of darkness as part of the test.
That's a powerful point regarding the philosophical purity of the challenge. I understand that aspect. But I'm not convinced that cultural purity can justify what looks very much like municipal negligence. Sheriff Huffersbach's testimony is just devastating here. He explicitly notes the lack of artificial light severely compromises rapid response capability for rescue and recovery operations. Refusing a simple flashlight means the municipality has implicitly accepted that recovery or rescue will be delayed for hours, until daylight or until the slough water level rises sufficiently to perhaps loosen the suction.
And this delay, it exponentially increases the risk for anyone immobilized by that vacuum effect, leaving them exposed, vulnerable to the predatory lungfish. This isn't merely allowing a risky activity. It is actively ensuring that when an inevitable crisis occurs, and it is inevitable, the public services cannot perform their duties effectively. We're talking about basic civic competence here, not just the abstract spirit of competition. It is important, though, to remember the nature of the risk involved. The source material tells us the core difficulty is the suction, the vacuum effect. That's the truly immobilizing and exhausting threat. That is the point of attrition. If a mucker is immobilized, they become, as the material notes, easy prey for the lungfish. The darkness is certainly a layer of difficulty, yes, but the root cause of death is the environment itself, which is what the participants are consenting to try and master. But the environment is managed or mismanaged by the code. And this leads us to the most, well, conceptually fascinating and deeply concerning element for me, the paradox of the muck-sucking lungfish. This is a genuinely strange ethical and conceptual contradiction, right at the heart of the muckhole tradition.
It is a remarkable paradox, I agree. The lungfish is a lethal hazard to the participants, a key part of the risk they face. Yet the event itself, the annual churn and the ecological disruption it causes, is simultaneously destroying the lungfish's natural habitat.
Exactly. Professor Underbunk's claim that muckers are literally being eaten by their own tradition confirms this bizarre ecological suicide pact. The event facilitates the death of the participants through predation by these fish, while simultaneously ensuring the eventual destruction of the very species that preys upon them. This just shows a profound lack of foresight in regulating the event. The municipality seems to view the ecosystem only as a hazard to be faced, not as a system that itself needs sustaining. It's an example of the tradition being so self-referential, so inwardly focused that it cannot see its broader systemic impact.
I must challenge the idea that this is a willful misunderstanding on the part of the local government, though.
I would argue that the municipality frames this ecological complexity as an inherent and perhaps necessary part of the muckhole environment that participants choose to face. The dangers, the vacuum, and the lungfish are inextricably linked challenges within that environment. Look at Arnold Pittle's strategy, for instance. It highlights this. Those sprinting early, he says, are going to be feeding those hungry muck-sucking lungfish. This suggests that the ecosystem risk is integrated into the required mental discipline and strategy of the run. The participants know these dangers. Managing the broader ecosystem health is undoubtedly a regulatory duty, yes, but the town council seems to see it as separate from the specific regulation of the run itself, which merely uses the existing environment as its proving ground.
But that separation is artificial, and it's precisely what leads to the crisis. The code protects the run, which creates the physical condition immobilization via the vacuum effect that makes muckers vulnerable. This vulnerability leads to deaths via lungfish predation, and the run also causes the ecological disruption that is killing the very creatures central to the risk. The legal code is protecting a spiraling crisis. If the event is destroying the lungfish habitat, how long before that habitat destruction fundamentally alters the characteristics of the muckhole itself, perhaps making the vacuum effect worse or introducing new unforeseen hazards? The municipal code is protecting a tradition that is, quite literally, rapidly consuming its own context.
The point that the tradition is consuming its own context is a sophisticated observation, and it does force us to consider the long-term sustainability of this legal exemption. However, the immediate legal defense remains robust. The participants enter with full knowledge that this environment is both deadly and constantly shifting. The legal framework provides the freedom for muckers to engage in this high-risk affirmation, regardless of the perceived proportionality. The waffle bucket, after all, carries significant cultural meaning within muckhole itself, bizarre as it sounds to us.
And that is fundamentally where we diverge. While I respect the century of legal precedent and the principle, of cultural self-determination, the source material documents a clear, predictable, and repeated failure of public safety, specifically due to the active impediment of rescue operations caused by that darkness rule. When a tradition actively ties the hands of emergency services, the government moves from merely allowing risk to, I believe, facilitating negligence. The human cost here, the annual loss of life, is simply non-negotiable from a basic governance perspective.
This discussion has certainly illuminated the critical tension inherent in the muckhole legal structure, hasn't it? We are weighing the freedom of informed participants to engage in extreme, even self-inflicted risk versus the overarching legal and ethical obligation of a governing body to ensure basic safety standards, especially when that municipal code explicitly overrides what local officials themselves call general common sense.
Exactly. The material compels us and listeners to examine just how far legal precedent and cultural tradition can extend when confronting modern expectations of civic safety and responsibility. It asks us to weigh competing values, the value placed on tradition, the strange economic incentive of the waffle bucket, and the fundamental sanctity of human life against the very tangible evidence of the vacuum effect and the lungfish predation. The muckhole case suggests that even the most deeply rooted traditions must eventually face rigorous regulatory challenge when the documented human cost becomes this consistently high.
A powerful tension absolutely remains, and I suspect there's much more to be explored in the specific details of the muckhole code and its history. Thank you for joining us for The Debate.